On 22nd January 1560, Wang Zhi was executed at Hangzhou. He had not come ashore as a prisoner taken in battle. He had come because Ming officials had drawn him into negotiations. He had asked for pardon, a naval commission, and the reopening of trade. He offered to bring armed seafarers back under state control. The court chose the blade. The Ming court thought it was executing a pirate. 7 years later, it would quietly accept part of what he had demanded. The question is not whether Wang Zhi was innocent. He was not an ordinary merchant by the 1550s. The harder question is why a state that needed his network alive decided to kill the one man who might have helped turn it back into trade. That is the case. A trader made illegal by a sea ban, a pirate network built from closed ports, and an execution that tried to solve a policy failure by removing a man. The map begins on the China coast, but not with a raid. It begins with a door. First, the closed door. For much of the Ming dynasty, private overseas trade was restricted by the Haicheng, the sea bans. The official theory was simple. Foreign trade should move through tribute, licensed missions, and state-supervised channels. Private merchants who sailed outside that frame crossed into crime. On paper, that looked like control. On the coast, it created a market with no lawful front door. Silk still had buyers. Silver still moved. Sulfur, saltpeter, cotton, ceramics, swords, and firearms still had roots. Japan needed goods from China. Chinese merchants wanted Japanese silver and island bases. Portuguese traders were entering the same waters. Southeast Asian ports were already part of the exchange. If a port was closed, the cargo did not vanish. It moved to another beach. Wang Zhi came from Hangzhou, a region known for merchants. Modern scholarship places him first inside commerce. Salt, cargo finance, storehouses, junks, and trading voyages. He was not born as a pirate captain in a storybook sense. He entered a maritime world where the difference between trader, smuggler, armed escort, and raider could shift with one imperial order. That is the first pressure in the case. The Ming state wanted the prophets and people of the coast to remain inside the empire, but it denied many of them a lawful way to use the sea. Second, the illegal port. By about 1540, Shuangyu, near the Zongxian Islands, had become one of the great illegal trade centers of the coast. It was not only a hideout, it was a port system, Chinese merchants, Japanese associates, Portuguese traders, brokers, guards, sailors, interpreters, lenders, and buyers. The state called this disorder. For the people using it, Shuangyu was infrastructure. Then the state broke it. In 1548, Zhu Wan, the official sent to break coastal smuggling, destroyed Shuangyu. The attack did not simply remove a base. It shattered credit, trust, and supply lines that had made illegal trade stable enough to function. When a black market has contracts, warehouses, and predictable anchorage, violence can remain controlled. When that structure is smashed and the legal market stays closed, armed trade has fewer reasons to stay orderly. That is where Wang Zhi's rise begins to matter. Third, the man with the network. The record does not require us to imagine him standing on a deck leading every attack. John Wills's study of maritime China says the opposite in careful terms. Wang seems to have remained more merchant mediator than battlefield commander, and may never have personally led a mainland attack. His power lay in contacts, credit, island bases, and the ability to speak to several worlds at once. He knew Chinese officials. He knew Japanese patrons. He had worked inside a trade network before he became one of its armed organizers. In this story, his function is simple. A trader who became a maritime broker of force. In Japan, he found protection near Hirado and the Goto Islands. He was received by Matsura Takanobu, and he styled himself as a lordly figure, the king of Huizhou. The title mattered less than the function. He was the man who could connect closed China to open demand. This is what made him dangerous. Not only the raids, the alternative. A coastal official could fight a raiding band. A raiding band had boats, weapons, and men. But Wang Zhi had a market. He could reward surrender, move goods, absorb rivals, borrow Japanese protection, use Chinese commercial trust, and turn official weakness into bargaining power. In 1542, he was already asking the Ming government for permission to trade. That detail changes the shape of the case. He was not only asking to escape punishment, He was asking the state to legalize the activity that had made him powerful. The state refused again. The refusal did not stay abstract. In the early 1550s, restrictions tightened so far that even fishing boats could be drawn into the logic of prohibition. At the scale of a boat, the policy looked different from how it looked in Beijing. A coastal household could have nets, debt, a hull, and knowledge of the channel. Yesterday, that boat was work. Today, the same hull could be evidence. No weather changed. No shoreline moved. The order changed. That is how policy becomes recruitment. A merchant who cannot sail legally still knows the buyer. A fisherman who cannot work safely still knows the channel. A clerk who handles cargo still knows whose debt is unpaid. A guard hired to protect a shipment can become the armed man beside a raiding party. None of this excuses the raids. It explains why the raids could find people. It also explains why one arrest could never be the whole cure. The raids grew. The official term was wokou. In older usage, it pointed toward Japanese pirates. By the mid-16th century on the Ming coast, that label hid more than it revealed. The records themselves show the problem. A Ming annal entry reports officials saying many of the raiders were Chinese. Another Ming-era account gives the Jiangnan Sea emergency as roughly 3 parts Japanese to 7 parts Chinese rebels. The label said one thing. The personnel record said another. That is the episode's myth versus record beat, and it matters because the wrong label gives the wrong cause. If the problem is only foreign raiders, the answer is border defense. If the problem is Chinese merchants, coastal gentry, fishermen, smugglers, displaced men, Japanese fighters, Portuguese traders, and island patrons inside one market, the answer is not only more soldiers. The answer has to include the policy that made the market illegal. The Ming court sometimes understood this. One official memorial described the issue as maritime banditry that could not be handled like mountain banditry. Mountain bandits had lairs that troops could attack. Sea raiders moved with wind, tide, ships, islands, and buyers. They could appear, sell, split, and return. The state was trying to arrest a coastline. By the mid-1550s, the raids reached a scale the government could not ignore. Coastal towns were hit. County seats and garrisons came under pressure. Suzhou, Hangzhou, and even the approaches toward Nanjing entered the alarm map. The damage was real. This episode does not soften that. People were killed. Villages and estates burned. Local defense systems failed. Government troops could be as frightening to civilians as the raiders when officials cheated rations or used emergency powers for extraction. But the violence was not random weather. It was attached to a trade system that had been forced outside the law and then militarized. The first government answer was suppression. The second was negotiation. Fourth, the trap. Zongxian became the key official in the Wang Zhi case. In this story, he is the negotiator and tactician of co-optation. He was from the same broader Huizhou world as Wang. He understood that killing every raider was not possible. He also understood that Wang's network could be broken from inside if Wang could be separated from his commanders and rivals. Hu's strategy was not simple mercy. It was co-optation mixed with deception. He negotiated. He encouraged defections. He pushed rival commanders against each other. He offered the possibility that Wang could redeem himself by serving the state against other sea forces. On a map, the campaign looks military. In the documents, it also looks like a struggle over trust. Trust was Wang Zhi's asset. The court needed it, but it did not want to admit that it needed it. In 1557, Wang Zhi arrived near Zongxian with a large trading fleet. He did not ask merely to be spared. He laid down terms: pardon, commission, open trade. In return, he offered service. He could patrol. He could persuade or force raiders back from the coast. He could turn his network from problem into instrument. That offer placed Zongxian in a trap. If Hu accepted it, he might calm the coast. But if he asked the emperor to open trade and spare Wang, his enemies could call it weakness or corruption. The court had factions. Hu had patrons. Those patrons had enemies. The fate of a maritime network now depended on men in Beijing who feared that compromise would make them look complicit. Wang came ashore because negotiations still seemed possible. He had crossed the water because the state had left him a door, a narrow one, political, dangerous, but still a door. In Hangzhou, he learned what kind of door it was. It opened inward, then it locked behind him. The Chouhai tubian tradition records the capture around Dinghai in stark terms. Wang sought trade, Hu drew him in, and Wang was seized. A later compiled account preserves the same bitter shape: assurances, hostages, ceremony, and then the move toward Hangzhou, where the hardline censor Wang Benggu entered the case. Wang Benggu's role is simple in the drama. He is the voice of no amnesty. This is the midpoint turn. Until this point, the case looks like a question about piracy. How did Wang Zhi build the network, and how did Ming officials bring him in? After Hangzhou, the question changes. The issue is no longer whether Wang Zhi could be captured. He had been. The issue is whether the Ming court could admit that the policy which produced him needed repair. Wang Zhi's surrender forced the state to choose between two stories. In the first story, he was a criminal leader whose execution would prove that the coast had been restored to order. In the second, he was evidence that the ban itself had turned commerce into armed crime, and that peace required a legal channel for the trade the state had failed to stop. The court chose the first story. The choice was not immediate. Wang remained in custody while officials argued around him. Some accounts say he expected pardon. Others disagree in detail. The safe claim is narrower. He surrendered under expectations of favorable treatment, and the imperial decision later moved against him. That distinction matters. The false amnesty was not a signed modern plea bargain. It was a political promise carried by envoys, hostage exchanges, respectful reception, and the logic of negotiation. Wang came in because he believed the door was still open. Then the door closed. In the Ming annals, the hard line appears before the execution. Accomplices who surrendered could be spared, but the leader would not be pardoned. That policy sentence is the blade before the blade. The state could absorb followers. It could use informants. It could reward those who turned on rivals. But Wang Zhi, as the symbol of the illegal sea market, had to be removed. Here the record is more revealing than any legend. It does not need to make Wang noble. It does not need to turn him into a martyr. It shows a government trying to separate useful coastal labor from the person who made that labor politically embarrassing. A pirate could be executed. A failed sea policy could not. The execution did not erase the network at once. Some of Wang's followers could be absorbed. Some forces had already been weakened by defections, militia reform, and military pressure. Jiajing and Yuegang, commanders associated with later anti-wokou reform, helped rebuild the response with trained troops, new tactics, and more disciplined coastal defense. Modern military history credits those reforms as part of the decline of large-scale wokou activity, but Wang's killing also warned the remaining sea leaders what negotiation might cost. If surrender could end at Hangzhou, then surrender was not only a path to pardon, it was a risk. This is where the aftermath divides. The Ming state did gain ground. By the early 1560s, the Jiangnan and Jiajing coast was no longer in the same emergency state. Some raiders shifted south to Fujian and Guangdong. Some were defeated, some surrendered, some moved into other waters. But the larger solution did not come from execution alone. Fifth, the policy admits what the execution denied. In 1567, after the Jiajing emperor died, the Longqing opening relaxed the maritime bans for private trade. The new legal outlets centered on Yuegang, near Haicheng in Fujian, while Japan remained a special exclusion. The timing matters. When legal channels expanded, the scale of this kind of coastal piracy declined. Kung and Ma's economic study gives a sharper quantitative point. Rigorous trade suppression from 1550 to 1567 was associated with a rise in pirate attacks, especially in coastal prefectures with high trade potential. That finding does not make every raider a victim of policy. It does something more useful. It shows the mechanism. Block a profitable route, leave demand alive, criminalize the men who know the sea, break the ports that kept smuggling predictable, then send weak local forces against armed traders who can move faster than the bureaucracy. The result is not order, it is an illegal economy with sails. Wang Zhi did not create all of that. He occupied the opening it gave him. He became powerful because he could do what the Ming state would not do: connect the coastal economy to the maritime market and protect that connection with force. So the final map has two layers: the execution at Hangzhou, and the open channel in Fujian. One is punishment, the other is policy repair. This is why the obvious framing fails. It is not a simple story of outsiders attacking China, nor is it a redemption story for Wang Zhi. It is a case in which state policy, coastal commerce, foreign demand, and armed brokerage became one problem, and the official language kept naming only part of it. The record says the word wokou. The record also says many were Chinese. The record says Wang Zhi was a leader of sea rebels. The record also shows him repeatedly connected to trade, petitions, and negotiations. The record says the court executed him. The record also leaves the larger policy problem standing in the room after his death. I read the case as a failure of category. The Ming state had words for tribute, crime, rebellion, and foreign raiding. It had fewer safe words for a Chinese maritime merchant who had become too useful to ignore and too illegal to pardon. So the state made him legible in the only way that protected the policy. It made him a condemned pirate. The final irony is that the later policy shift admitted part of the point Wang Zhi had tried to bargain for. The sea could not be closed into obedience. Trade needed a lawful channel, or it would buy an unlawful one. Hangzhou was supposed to end a pirate case. It did end Wang Zhi. But the case did not begin with his raids, and it did not end with his execution. It began when the sea ban turned coastal trade into a crime scene, and it ended only when the state accepted that a closed port can become a recruiting office. The execution solved the man. The opening of trade solved more of the case. Visual reconstructions in this video are AI-assisted and grounded in historical sources cited in the description. They are not archival footage.